Howdy, I'm Kate Kavanaugh, and you're listening to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, where we're laying the groundwork for our land, ourselves, and for generations to come by looking at the way every thread of life is connected to one another. Communities above ground mirror the communities below the soil, which mirror the vast community of the cosmos. As the saying goes, as above, so below. Join me as we take a curious journey into agriculture, biology, history, spirituality, health, and so much more. I can't wait to unearth all of these incredible topics alongside you. Hello, and welcome to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. Maybe it's called the Groundwork podcast. Who really knows anymore? I'm your host, Kate Kavanaugh, and in this podcast, we like to explore the threads of what it means to be humans woven into this earth. And I'm going to keep today's introduction pretty brief. And I just want to thank you all for being here. Some events this week has brought into immense relief just how much recording this podcast has meant to me and how much your listenership and consideration has meant to me. And to get to explore hard and nuanced and complex, sticky topics with people has been one of the greatest pleasures of my life. And this episode is no different. And I want to say at the outset, I think that the wonderful guest and I perhaps don't agree, and you'll hear this at the end of the episode because I'm not an interviewer that really likes to push back too hard. I don't think we agree about meat's role in the food system, but we certainly agree on a desperate, and I can't underscore that enough, a desperate need to rethink labor and supply chains, especially the human hands that touch meat within this industry. So today I'm talking to author and journalist Alice Driver about her book, Life and Death of the American Worker, the Immigrants Taking on America's Largest Meatpacking Company, where she really delves into the very unseen. I think this is one of the most unseen industries that exist in America, certainly, of meat packers at Tyson Foods. And, this discussion highlights the abhorrent working conditions that they are experiencing. And that includes the isolation, the fear, the social ramifications of this, and the challenges that they force in organizing to have better lives for themselves. And I think that this episode really tugs at the implications of the true cost of food, that often goes unnoticed when we just pick up a package off the shelves. This is a big episode, and I don't even really know how to introduce it, is the truth. And I do want to make a note that this was recorded last fall. And so hold that temporal perspective in your mind as you listen, since things have changed since last fall. And thank you. Thank you for being here and being a listener of this podcast. If it's something that you want to hear more, we have some really exciting interviews coming up. Please hit subscribe. Please rate and review the podcast. It really helps people find it, helps me get some eyeballs on my work. And just thank you. Thank you for being here and listening. And without further ado, here is Alice Driver. I mean, first of all, I'm just so honored to have you on, and seeing this book getting written is something that, and the incredible grace and grit with which you wrote it is something that I think is so important. I was just telling you, I've worked in the meat industry for a long time. And throughout that time, one of the things that I've said is that I think that kill floors, slaughterhouses are one of the most unseen industries in the United States. We talk a lot about farmers. We do not talk a lot about slaughter workers. And I think that is a mistake. And so I'm so thrilled that you wrote this book, and thank you for it.
No, thank you for having me. I mean, I'm so curious to hear about your experience because I wrote this book, but I have never set foot in, inside of a meat processing facility.
Yeah. Well, I haven't, I mean, no surprise, I haven't been in any of the big processing facilities. I've
Hmm.
only been in much, much smaller processing facilities where, their max capacity is going to be somewhere between 50 and 300 larger animals a day, not
Hmm.
poultry, or, as many as maybe 500 birds, which is incredibly small in comparison. But I've been in a fair few processors and seen I think at that smaller scale, there is sometimes a different attention to workers. There is sometimes a more family business oriented where workers, but I think across the board, there is not a lot of care taken for workers within the slaughter industry. It is
Hmm.
one of the most underpaid, dangerous jobs in America.
It is. It definitely is.
Yeah.
I mean, so much of what I learned when I worked on this book was a surprise to me.
Yeah. Some of it was a surprise to me too. And that alone surprised me. I wonder if we might start with, you have this connection to Arkansas, and so much of this unfolds at the Tyson plant in Arkansas. And so thought just touch base here on your connection to Arkansas and to this story.
I was born in the Ozark Mountains in a small town called Oark. I think right now it has probably 100 and something people. It's, really rural. And the Ozark Mountains is also the home of Tyson Foods, which is the largest meatpacking company in the United States and the second largest globally. And so growing up, around me were chicken houses, and there's a Tyson plant that's about 45 minutes from where I grew up, and a lot of people that I knew worked there. And so it was something that I was aware of, um, when I became a journalist, I began to think about the lives of workers, and that I knew nothing, absolutely nothing about what was happening inside plants and how it was affecting, what were labor conditions and what kind of things were workers facing daily. And I just wanted to know, and I thought, why is this industry so secretive? Because it
Yes.
really is. They have it locked down. Like,
Yes.
they have whatever they have learned how to do, they have silenced almost everyone.
Yes. I mean, I think that it is, like I said, the most obfuscated, unseen, invisible industry. And you said something here that I pulled out, speaking about your experience, seeing people that had worked in some of these plants throughout your childhood. And you said their labor was invisible, but I could see the marks of it on their bodies. And that really stuck out to me, that it is invisible labor and it is incredibly impactful labor on the people who do it and on our food system as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, by the time of the people that I interviewed in my book, by the time I finished the book, which took me about 4 years, almost every person in the book is either disabled,
Yeah.
dead, or no longer works at Tyson.
Yeah. I wondered if you might give us a little peek, and this is something that we can do together too, but if you might give us a little peek at some of the harrowing conditions that workers face inside of these plants, just to kind of lay the groundwork for the conversation.
Well, I think that one of the things that is surprising, perhaps, to many people is that some things are very basic, like bathroom breaks.
Yeah.
Because really the bottom line is keeping production up in terms of processing chicken and other meats, that uh, that managers don't want workers to go to the bathroom, because if someone leaves a line, that lowers production. So there's basic things like the difficulty of going to the bathroom, and then other things like safety equipment. A lot of workers complained about the lack of safety equipment in the correct size, which could, to someone who hasn't been inside a plant, maybe doesn't sound like that big of a deal. But if a lot of workers have to wear metal mesh
Cut
gloves to
gloves.
protect themselves from getting cut. And one of the stories in my book is a worker who couldn't find her size glove, and ended up injuring herself, I think cutting to the bone, because she needed a small glove, but all that was available was a large one. And so these are things that are really easily fixed. They require investing in safety equipment. And then larger things like the worker in Alabama who was decapitated while cleaning
Yeah.
a machine because the machine lacked the safety. There's a safety that would prevent it from turning on while a person was inside it, and the machine hadn't been maintained. So there's just some accidents that are really horrific that I think a lot of people don't hear about, or there's very little reporting on them. It's hard. It's often hard to interview the individuals involved or their families because, and this is something that's not in my book, but that I heard about a lot was the use of NDAs or of
Mhm.
payments. And so a lot of workers and families are really, they're silenced, and then they're not, able to speak about any of these issues.
Yeah, and there is also, I mean, present in your book is the fear of what might happen if they speak out and they are found out, at threat of losing their job.
Of losing their job. And and the thing about these companies, and like Tyson, other companies, is their plants are in really small towns. The largest
Yeah,
plant in Arkansas is in Green Forest, which is a town of about 3,000. And what that means is if you get fired, where else are you going to get a job in
yeah,
that town? And workers talked about this. Not only, are they afraid of being fired, they're afraid that they will not be able to get work anywhere else because these are places where the money that this company has really controls a lot of the economy and influences politicians. And so it's
media.
a complicated situation for
Yeah.
workers.
Yeah, something I noticed throughout the book is that there is this theme that emerges about how isolated workers are, and I kind of made they're isolated, from their community from a lot of different aspects. They're isolated from one another. You talk about some of the divisions of not being able to understand their languages, how they're pitted against one another. They're isolated from their own language, that so much of business is conducted in English, and you are not able to request documents in the language that you speak and therefore understand the NDA or the liability waiver that you might be signing. And they're isolated from what you just said, from other options, that this is their option. And so there was just kind of this deep sense of isolation throughout the book.
It's really true in these small towns, which Arkansas is a state that is predominantly white. It's not a lot of people speak Spanish, and so the workers in my book, most of whom speak Spanish, but some of them speak Korean or Marshallese, and so it puts them in a situation where they are isolated, especially in these small towns, because there are not services and translators and all of these things that might be available in a larger city.
Yeah, and then not within Tyson itself. I mean, that really, and I could see the way that that isolation from one another, from the language that they speak, was used as a form of coercion in order to keep them working in absolutely terrible conditions.
It's really hard for them to organize because in any given plant you might have 20 or 50 different languages.
Yeah,
And I had trouble reporting this story because when I started this, it was one article and I had a little bit of funding. I didn't have funding to have translators of multiple languages driving
sure.
around the state with me. And so I
Right.
realized really quickly that I needed to work in Spanish because I speak Spanish. But working in Vietnamese and Korean and Marshallese in Arkansas, I
Yeah.
just didn't have the bandwidth or the budget to do that in depth work the way that I could in Spanish.
Mm. I didn't even think about that component of it. Yeah. And
Yeah,
just
because imagine me paying for a translator for all these languages for 4 years. I mean, it
yeah.
was it just became unmanageable even in the beginning of this project. I realized I'm gonna have to focus on workers who are Spanish speakers because I cannot manage the other languages.
I think, and I mean, I think that's just one amongst what are very many reasons why this story is so difficult to tell and yet so important to tell. right? That
Mhm.
it is a hard story to tell, and there are a lot of hurdles to get around in order to tell it.
There are. I mean, the biggest hurdle is the worry. I mean, last year Tyson had sales of $53 billion.
Yeah.
So imagine me as a journalist, an individual who's from Arkansas, if everyone in the process of doing this is asking me, "Aren't you worried about being sued?" And I think when you're writing about a company that has so much money, that is a worry because I'm just one person, and what I
Yeah.
have present is the truth. And I was lucky to have a lot of support from lawyers, and a legal team at Cornell University reviewed the book for me, but there is that fear for sure because it's so much money.
This wasn't on my radar, but will you talk a little bit about what pushed you through that fear? Because I think that this is an untold story, and your decision to tell it, despite that being a very a potential reality of being sued for having written this book. I know that you talk some about moral beauty at the beginning, about love as not a feeling but an action. But
Mhm.
can you talk a little bit about what drove you to tell the story?
Well, it started as one article, but in the beginning of the pandemic, and it is emotional because this was such a hard story to tell. And there were so many points at which I almost quit. Um and it I was very lucky to have support from different editors, and um, from my editor at Simon and Schuster, because I really could not have done this without. There were so many people, especially lawyers, involved in this book.
Yeah,
I mean, I can't tell you how many lawyers have been in my life since I started this project. Um,
I didn't even think
but
about
it's the
that.
workers. The workers are what got me through this.
Yeah.
Really just seeing their resilience and their will to organize. I mean, that's for me, that's the point of the book, is workers organizing themselves to talk
Yes.
about what they need to see to work in safe labor conditions.
Yeah. I want to get into that. And I wonder if just first we might touch on this one piece that I think is really important, because I really want to get into workers' ability to organize. I want to talk a little bit about the vertical integration. And I think my listeners will be pretty familiar with the vertical integration that exists within the four big packers in this country and within the meat industry. But what really struck me, and something that I wasn't aware of, is the vertical integration of workers within this sort of paradigm. And I pulled this quote where you say, just as Tyson had vertically integrated every aspect of animal production, from feed to hatcheries to slaughter, the company wanted to control every part of workers' lives, especially their health. Wielding such control allowed the company to cut costs with little oversight of their treatment of workers or animals.
hmm Yeah, when I started, I knew that everything's vertically integrated. So, for example, chicken houses, which there have been some great stories recently, for example, about chicken houses in Missouri,
Yeah.
because Tyson shut down plants, and they're vertically integrated, but they're third party hires. So it means that, the individuals who own the chicken houses take on all the costs and all the risks,
Hmm.
and Tyson just gives them the chickens and the feed.
Yeah.
But in the case of the on-site medical clinics, I didn't know that existed. And
I didn't
workers
either.
they would say, "Oh, the Tyson nurse told me this," or "The Tyson doctor told me that." And I remember I went to Magali Lacoli, who's the director of Venceremos, which is this great organization in Arkansas that's supporting poultry workers. I went to her and I said, "What is this?" And she said, "I've heard workers talk about this too, but she didn't actually, it was like, how do you get inside that medical system?" And so I eventually found a nurse who had worked at several Tyson plants who, uh, she wanted to be anonymous, but I interviewed her about, what it looks like to work as a nurse inside, at a Tyson clinic.
Yeah. And I mean, this really struck me. I just can't say, and as somebody, I have a repetitive motion injury from being a butcher, and I've done far fewer than the daily work that these workers are doing. And I was struck by, I mean, first of all, your tales about the women that would eviscerate or cut chicken, whatever their role on that assembly line was in their sleep, that their
Mhm.
hands would automatically go through these motions that their body had become so accustomed, so traumatized to. And whether it was these repetitive motion injuries or some of these bigger chemical injuries, whatever that was, that they go to this Tyson nurse, and the incentive is there to keep complaints. They don't want these complaints going to OSHA. They don't
Mhm.
want to have to pay out, and all of these workers being told they're fine and they can take or even pay for, I think it was
Mhm.
50 cents to have Advil dispensed
Yeah,
for
they have
them.
vending machines for pain medication, which I think also is true of Amazon warehouses. It must be part of the industry. But yeah, workers, are told to go buy their own pain medication, and the nurse that I interviewed said, "Look, we do our best, but our job is to keep they call it OSHA calls it recordable injuries, keep recordable
Yeah.
injuries down. So anything that's classified as first aid is not a recordable injury, which is why so many workers are told, ice your given ice, given Tylenol, and told
Yeah.
to go back to work."
Yeah, I mean, that just stuck with me in the biggest way, and I mean, yet another way in which you're isolated even from the feelings of your own body. And throughout the book, there are workers that are repeatedly going back and saying, "I something is truly wrong,"
Mhm, mhm.
and being denied that. Um,
And Tyson, when because I communicated with Tyson Public Relations during the 4 years of this book, they said, "We don't have nurses, we don't have doctors," because it's a third party. The on-site medical is a third party hire. And so that's how they often distance themselves from things. The same is true of sanitation, which is where you're most likely to find children working. Sanitation is a third party hire. So a lot of things the company distances itself from via these third party hires that they have. So they said, "We do not have doctors and we do not have nurses." And they were very clear on that point. But for workers, workers just say the Tyson nurse. That's how they see
yeah,
it.
yeah. Wow. I mean, I don't even know I don't even know what to say. And I mean, this is and as profitable as they are. I want to touch on this lawsuit before I mean, maybe we talk a little bit about how workers begin to organize before we touch on the lawsuit. We've gotten a chance to hear about these conditions, and I really was struck by Magali's work in helping these workers to work together in order to organize, leading up to this lawsuit that is kind of central to the book.
Mhm. Magali Lacoli is the director of Venceremos, which is an organization it was founded by 16 immigrant women who work in poultry processing in Arkansas in 2019. And when I started writing the book, Venceremos was they were focusing on issues related to chemical use and chemical accidents. But then when the pandemic hit, they really had to pivot and focus on safety issues related to the pandemic. And in my book, I follow a couple from El Salvador who both worked at Tyson at one point, Angelina and Placido. And Placido dies of COVID in July of 2020. And and he dies, and then a bunch of other workers who I had been following die. And most of them had previously been in a chemical accident. And so for me, the deaths of these workers tell not only the story of pandemic labor conditions, but the story in general of working in meatpacking because they were in a chemical accident that severely damaged their lungs. And when COVID arrived, many of them predicted their own death. They said, if I get COVID, I am going to die because their lungs were already damaged. And so when Placido died, his wife Angelina, she is illiterate. She doesn't speak English. She's never been to school. And she is really the one that galvanized the push to what can we do to get justice for those members of our family who died due to labor conditions at Tyson. And they looked for a lawyer in Arkansas. They did not find a single lawyer, which doesn't surprise me at all. I couldn't even find a lawyer who would speak to me on the record about Tyson in the state of Arkansas. I
Wow.
mean, everything is so incredibly challenging. So they, with the help of Venceremos, found a lawyer outside of the state and began to organize a lawsuit, but they could not file a wrongful death lawsuit
Yeah.
because Arkansas is a state that passed limited liability legislation, which said no company is responsible for COVID, anything related to COVID. So the lawsuit had to be, they framed it around emotional and psychological distress and harm. And it's an argument that hasn't been made that much. And so it was a little bit of a test. And obviously I hoped that they would win and that my book could tell the story of how they won. But as someone from Arkansas, I really did not think that they would win. And they, Arkansas closed the case, and the workers are continuing to organize in spite of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think throughout the book, there is this sense of the amount of embeddedness between the state of Arkansas, the sort of stranglehold that both Tyson and Walmart have on the state of Arkansas. And I have a quote here, but and we've talked about it, that the media outlets write business friendly articles, that the government is very friendly, but there is, and you speak about this throughout the book, a national push for deregulation in these plants, for a lack of oversight, that OSHA is chronically underfunded. You detail the rise of, I think it's the original son of Tyson and Bill Clinton together, and sort of these relationships between corporations and state that really make what I think is throughout history a race to the bottom on labor, on paying labor, possible via the state at the state and national level.
Yeah, I mean, Tyson, and this isn't just Tyson, this is the consolidated power of meatpacking. They're lobbying.
Yeah.
They lobby Democrats, Republicans, Clinton, Bush.
Oh yeah.
They were all, in my book, I recount how they met with the Trump administration during the pandemic, and really workers died because they lobbied Trump to keep plants open. And so we're talking about the problem in the US of the unlimited ability of corporations to lobby and influence politicians and those kinds of relationships. And on a smaller level, you can see it in Arkansas, and you see it in my book. There's a point at which Tyson is found to be writing the emails of the mayor of Springdale, and Springdale's the headquarters of Tyson Foods.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't make it up, right? That's how deeply embedded it is, and I think that adds this layer of difficulty in workers organizing. I mean, that it is very disincentivized for them to do so, and at great risk. And so, I mean, with that, can you talk a little bit about how the workers begin to come together, and a little bit about what that, I mean, you talked a little bit about Angeline and Placido and their story throughout the book, and that she is really this force that galvanizes it. And I mean, maybe we talk about it either through this lens or at a larger scale, because this really is about making this, how do we make this more of a reality where workers are able to organize and bargain for better working conditions in these invisible spaces?
Well, with Venceremos, Arkansas is a state that is historically anti-labor, that has for decades passed legislation. For example, Arkansas was the first state to pass right to work legislation, which is a nice name for anti-union and anti-organizing behavior. And it's a difficult place to organize, and workers really didn't have any context for what it means to organize or what their rights are. I mean, they're very afraid. And so for me, one of the most powerful moments in the book is when I traveled with Arkansas poultry workers and Venceremos to Florida to meet with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is a very powerful worker-led movement made up of agricultural workers. And it's really a model for Venceremos. And so the poultry workers spending time with the agricultural workers and seeing them, they have their own radio station, they protest
Mm.
publicly, they speak out, they talk to journalists using their own names, they're not afraid to be in photos. All of these things in Arkansas are absolutely almost impossible. Workers are not doing interviews, they're not using their own name, they're not in photos. I mean, whenever you do, if you look at I have photos in my book, all the photos are of hands or shadows or flowers because workers don't want to be identified for fear of what could happen to them. So seeing the workers in Florida really, really, I mean, the Arkansas workers had a vision like what is possible over time because the Florida workers have been organizing for 20 years. So, sometimes change, especially in a state like Arkansas, is going to take time.
Yeah. And I think that that piece, that being able to see what is possible, is an incredibly important step in just knowing that this is an option. And again, that piece of isolation, that if you don't know that this is an option, and so opening up that door. I wonder if you might talk about a little bit of incarcerated labor and how that plays into this story, because I felt that that was a piece too in looking at these places and the obfuscation of how they're run. And I think ultimately for me, the true cost of food that we
Mhm.
are. Yeah.
Well, when I was interviewing worker, I think it was a worker from Mexico. He said something about, I can't remember what day of the week it is that incarcerated workers come in, but he said, "Oh yeah, I was working next to so and so who, and then he said whatever this person was in jail for." And and so when I started to look into it, I interviewed an organization in Arkansas called Decarcerate, which which works with formerly imprisoned people. And the director of Decarcerate told me, and this is kind of I got obsessed with. He said, "You know that Tyson buys corn from the prison in Arkansas, and Arkansas is a state that pays $0 prisoners for their work, and the particular prison where there is a farm, it's you could say infamous because it's a prison that was built on the side of a plantation. It has a very large percentage of Black incarcerated people, and they're there growing corn among cotton, corn, watermelons. And Tyson is buying corn from the prison. And so I went and interviewed a formerly imprisoned person who was imprisoned at the age of 14, which could be a whole nother story. He was sent
Yeah.
to an adult prison. And he spent decades farming the prison farm, and he said, I was growing corn for Tyson. And so even though there's all these kind of distant relationships, and I really wanted to trace that out and what that means. And so that was another surprise for me. I didn't think I would be writing about an imprisoned person growing corn for Tyson.
Will you maybe actually, when you say that you wanted to trace those distant relationships, because there is this kind of small parallel track that runs as you explore some of the incarcerated labor and these four states in this region that don't pay
Hmm.
incarcerated labor. Can you tell me some of what you might have come to on what it means?
Well, Tyson has done, you could say, an incredible job of finding all of these ways to cut costs. Whether that be, one of the situations that I include in my book, which was reported by, it was reported by another media outlet, but it was that Tyson was receiving labor. It had a relationship with um, rehabilitation centers for alcoholics and drug addicts, where they could choose, rather than going to jail, they could choose to go to rehab, which ended up being working at Tyson. So they have all
Whoa.
these strange relationships with different, and it's different in different states. This, I think, was in Oklahoma. Um, and and so I'm sure there's more of that in other states, and I only scratched the surface of so many things. I need
I know.
a team of 100 people,
Yeah,
or hopefully other
you
people will
do.
pick this up.
You do. I mean, this is one story mostly focused, and I think it mostly in one plant.
Yeah. Oh, it was reported by ProPublica, which is
Yep, ProPublica
absolutely
is great. Yeah,
does the best investigative work
yeah,
out there.
absolutely. I'll have a link to that in the show notes too.
Mhm.
ProPublica does a great job. Um, I think I was struck in this, and you said before that uh, to me this is part of the true cost of food, that we don't see the true cost of food. We don't see the what it would take for fair wages to be paid
Mhm.
in the labor. We don't see the environmental costs. We don't see the cost to our communities. We don't see all of that reflected in that price bit. And the rate at which, on the podcast, we've been doing a lot of explorations around labor and unions, especially as it comes to textile manufacturing and also throughout history, is that there's this race to the bottom for cheap labor to make things affordable, but it's not affordable. Like that true cost is not represented.
I mean, there's two things for me. One is in the US, and really we are in the era of promoting unlimited. Oh, unlimited, you can eat as much meat as you want. It's going to be super inexpensive. And the part of the issue with the consolidated meatpacking industry is, one, even though maybe we think we're getting uh, a lower price of meat, they have been accused of colluding to fix prices,
Yep.
and they are colluding to keep the price of labor down.
Yeah.
So this structure, this consolidated structure, is not serving consumers. It's not serving workers. And the other part of it is that we have to address, thinking of climate change, the issue that we should not be eating an unlimited amount of meat. That is
Yeah.
not the future. And I don't know why, even for health reasons, why we as a country have really gotten on board with the idea that unlimited meat consumption is a part of our identity.
Hmm. Yeah. Actually, you mentioned something there, and as we begin to, I want to make sure you make your next appointment well. But as we begin to wrap up, one of the things that I really thought about towards the end was, I have this little quote here, and you say that sitting in Rosario's kitchen, Magali asked what she wanted consumers to know about labor conditions at Tyson. Rosario wished consumers knew about the number of injuries at plants and would buy food from companies that showed respect for safety. Rosario wanted consumers to choose their food based on how companies treated their workers. And to me, that felt like a really salient piece in the book, right? And
Mhm.
and and I think that we have a lot of conversations around humane treatment of animals, and I think
Mhm.
of farmers at times, but we do not have this conversation, and to harken back to the beginning about treatment, fair wages, and healthy working conditions for laborers in these places, and choosing food with that in mind.
Mhm. Yeah, there's a lot of outrage about treatment of animals, and for me there's been a disconnect
Yeah.
in, for some reason, the groups that deal with animal welfare really rarely touch on welfare for the people working in these plants. And often they demonize them. They'll say, "Oh, they're violent," or why would you choose to do this all day?" And as if they're sort of blaming the workers for what's happening in the plants. And so I think that really needs to change. It would be great if animal welfare and the welfare of workers could be subjects that were addressed together and with respect for the workers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this has been, I can't tell you how many times I've said it. Like, this is a place that we do not see, and that it's incredibly important that we begin to see inside of. I, I want to I want to touch on briefly. You had a little bit piece again from Rosario towards the end that really caught me, especially as we move into a very different realm of mechanization, or a dream of mechanization. I mean, I think that is the capitalist dream, right? Is to replace the worker.
Mhm.
And Rosario says something, and in the book you say, Tyson treated workers like machines until they could develop the needed robots. Rosario, disabled from decades of work, said, as long as you serve Tyson, you are a machine, and they don't bother you. But later, they threaten you when you don't serve them. Rosario admitted that she could never rest. They convert us into robots, and we work in our sleep. And she wasn't the only one.
Yeah, the whole issue with workers who continue to do their, their repetitive motion labor
Mhm.
in their sleep, that I was one day I was talking to a worker, and not even for the purposes of an interview, I was talking about my dreams at what I had dreamed at night. And the worker said to me, "Oh, well, I just keep working in my sleep." And I was like, "What do you mean? What does that mean?" And so that this and then I began to ask other workers, "Do you feel like you're continuing to work in your sleep?" And so I had, one worker said, "I work so much in my sleep that I scratch myself and I scratch my husband, and I went to my doctor and asked, what can I do, to not have this problem at night?" And it to me it speaks to what happens when we treat humans like machines.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that is this piece of treating humans like machines on these assembly lines. That this, I mean, this is mechanization. This is the treating of humans like machines, and not even considering their welfare in the same way that we talk about animal welfare.
Mhm. Mhm.
I mean, like Rosario says here towards the end, and that wanting to consumers to choose their food based on how companies treated their workers. Is there anything salient that you feel in this conversation? And I'll point everybody at the book, which is absolutely incredible. And hearing these people's, there are so many incredible characters, um, people, not characters, throughout the book, and really reading it. But is there anything that we might have missed here within the context of this conversation?
I mean, in order for us as a country to buy meat and chicken that's produced in conditions where workers are safe and are cared for, we really have to think about, because many of the big companies run the market. So this means going outside of that system and buying locally, and also buying less or not buying meat. I mean, the future really tells us climate change, if we're listening, that we are headed towards a future in which many of us, there is not going to be an unlimited source of meat, and we should be thinking about becoming a vegetarian, becoming a vegan. These are all things that are very possible. And unfortunately, our culture really focuses on meat and masculinity, and this idea that, especially among certain political parties, that you have to eat so much meat and it should be always available, and that with no thought towards labor conditions or towards animals.
Yeah, I hear that. I mean, I think, and I'll just be honest here, that we might have slightly different viewpoints. I've worked in regenerative ag, and I do think that there's a different place for meat, both within an ecological and a worker context. But I also know that there's a lot of different viewpoints on this, and I welcome them. And I mean, I think that we share a deep concern for how people are treated within this system. And I
Hmm.
think that's reflected across the board. I'm so grateful for you for writing this book, and I know what a labor it was on your part. And I mean, just getting to hear a little piece of that where the hurdles that you had to take to get this book written, and the lawyers and all of the obfuscation that's here. And so I just thank you for doing that. And I think I'll come back to that piece to wrap up about moral beauty, because that really resonated with me, and that love is an action, and you've taken a lot of action here, and hopefully, and I want to harken back to something you said, open the door for others to take action and to begin to tell the many stories that need to be told about this.
Yeah, I do hope this opens the door for more journalists and researchers and everybody who's interested in this topic, because there's so much work to do and to improve labor conditions in the meatpacking industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. And I'll have links for everybody to find the book and to find you. Anything else you want to add here at the end?
No, thank you for having me, Kate. And I hope everyone will look up Venceremos and the Coalition for Immokalee Workers and support these worker-led organizations, whether that be volunteering, donating money, or whatever you're able to do.
I was going to ask, is there I assume there's worker organizations like this in most states, or is that something that is Venceremos, something that's fairly unique to the southern United States and Arkansas?
In the southern United States, I don't think the southern United States is typically the part of the United States that is the most difficult for workers because of anti-labor laws and anti-unionizing laws and things like that. So these are the two organizations that I wrote about in my book. I'm sure there are more, but I think it's a model that is just beginning to take hold, and I hope we see more of it.
Yeah, and by supporting these outfits, that is supporting that model and its ability to expand. Well, great. Thank you very much, and we'll have links to all of this. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. If what you found resonated with you, may I ask that you share it with your friends or leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts? This act of reciprocity helps others find Mind, Body, and Soil. If you're looking for more, you can find us at groundworkcollective.com and at Kate_Kavanaugh, that's KATE_KAVANAUGH on Instagram. I would like to give a very special thank you to China and Seth Kent of the band All Right, All Right for the clips from their beautiful song Over the Edge from their album The Crucible. You can find them at All Right, All Right on Instagram and wherever you listen to music.